Welcome to our event and release of our first bulletin. This is what the recession looks like. This is an effort of the Recession Relief Coalition to document and bear witness to the impacts of this recession on individuals, families, communities, and community organizations. We are making recommendations today for governments to take action. We also hope more organizations across Canada may adopt this same kind of tool to tell their stories and call for change. First, I want to tell you a little bit about the Recession Relief Coalition. It's a broad-based group of organizations and individuals concerned about the impact of the recession on Canada's most vulnerable and marginalized people. Over 260 organizations and 1,100 individuals across Canada have endorsed the Coalition's call on the federal government to create a recession relief fund to prevent cuts to not-for-profit agencies serving vulnerable communities and to increase funding to support vital social services, including homelessness programs and settlement services. The Coalition is monitoring the impact of the recession through the collection of quantitative and qualitative data on the national, provincial, and local level. The Recession Relief Coalition is comprised of social services and social planning organizations, research groups, philanthropies, labor organizations, and concerned citizens and residents. We're working on the development of a local profile of indicators for Toronto that can be replicated in other communities across Canada. The needs you'll hear about are very real and very great, and we are calling on the federal government and other levels of government to act. Our recommendation areas are: we are seeking social assistance reform and increased incomes for people who receive social assistance and for those with low incomes, reduce barriers to social assistance, and new federal funding and leadership standards to address poverty and social assistance reform. Secondly, we are calling for EI reform, supporting the recommendations of the Good Jobs for All Coalition. And finally, we are calling for funding for the nonprofit sector, including housing and homelessness programs. We're seeking no cuts to funding, and in fact, expansion in funding to support nonprofit organizations serving vulnerable people, including children, youth, families, racialized communities, immigrants and refugees, those who are homeless, unemployed, underemployed, people with disabilities, and those suffering from mental illness. The oldest Canadians living amongst us have lived through 5 economic downturns: the Great Depression of the 1930s, the post-war recession of the 1950s, the oil shock of the 1970s, the inflation and interest rate downturn of the 1980s, and the structural recession, as we call it, of the early 1990s. After each of these 4 major downturns in our living memory, we rebuilt our social programs, our services, and the safety net that protects us all. But after the last recession in the 1990s, Canada turned in a different direction, towards markets and smaller governments for its answers. Our leaders were seduced by shiny new solutions and lost their collective memory. So often the case among those finally insulated by more than one generation from the lessons of the past. As we looked on, our governments cut holes in our safety net, remade the lie that poverty is a personal deficit, removed services, lowered wages, watched as inequality grew, defunded programs, and then promoted the mythology that markets would create the rising tide that raises all boats. But after the crash of 2008, when imperfect markets, not social spending, brought that party to a close, our governments moved fast to solve the problems that they created. Yet the same governments that presided over the longest and most relentless erosion of our safety net during better times are continuing to fail to recognize that the poorest and most vulnerable among us gained very little during what many believe to be one of the longest sustained recoveries of the post-war period. This means that the new stories of poverty emerging now resonate with an eerie similarity to a more distant past. One element of similarity was then as now, the federal government did not listen. Just this past week, our federal government tabled its intents towards poverty reduction in Geneva, Switzerland. And this is from the Monday announcement, and I quote, Canada does not accept Recommendation 17 or the related recommendation to develop a national strategy to eliminate poverty. Provinces and territories have jurisdiction in this area of social policy and have developed their own programs to address poverty. For example, 4 provinces have implemented poverty reduction strategies. The Government of Canada supports these measures, notably through benefits targeting children and seniors. These efforts are having a positive impact. Low income rates for seniors, women, and children have fallen considerably in the past decade. So the federal government does not support a poverty reduction strategy at a time when they own or control 85% of all the income programs that provide benefits to people in need in Canada. And the provinces to which they cede that responsibility literally own or control about 20% of that funding. So that's very interesting. But with so many unable to access employment insurance, with welfare doors often shut, the news stories resemble those we read from the 1930s when neither of these programs was truly in place. Our reason for being is to tell those stories and to fight for reinstatement of the social safety net in all its forms, services, income, and infrastructure. Failure to recognize the importance of the safety net was the great mistake of the early 1930s, as we all know, and for almost 60 years we learned and relearned the lessons. We set it aside in the 1990s and the first years of the new millennium. We cannot forget that lesson today. In terms of social assistance, just a few words on it. The human face of the social assistance changes that we see today is in the single persons. The single persons are rising in terms of those caseload numbers to the greatest degree that we have seen since the beginning of the program in 1998. In fact, the single person caseload has risen about 130,000, which is much higher than it has been throughout the first part of this millennium. So that's the canary down the well, and that's the litmus test for this recession. I'd like to point out to you that we are looking at benefits now for a single person are $572 per month. $572 is the amount that was recommended by the Social Assistance Review Committee in 1988 as the amount that should be paid to a single person. If the amount that was paid to a single person in 1993 had been increased with inflation, it would now be at $872, fully $300 per month higher than the amount that's currently paid. The asset limits are $572 also for that single person. And if someone were to come on to social assistance and only be allowed to have $572, it's going to be a long time before they're going to be able to buy the services and supports that would take them out of that trap. So the $572 is paid to a single person. A mother with one child receives $920 in Ontario Works and almost $450 per month in child benefits. Yet if we look at the cost of a one-bedroom apartment, that amount is $645 in Windsor and a high of $927 in Toronto, leaving very little left over to be able to afford the necessities of life. This is the first post-workfare recession, and the first where asset limits are at all-time lows in terms of it doesn't matter whether you go back to 1948, 1961, it doesn't matter how far back you go, the program is at its tightest that it's ever been.
You came in and talked to us about an upcoming social assistance review. Has that actually commenced? Have they decided which form it's going to take and how long it's going to take?
Thanks very much. The government has, I think, 10 days left in the official spring that goes to June 21st. It's June 11th today. They said they would announce the review in the spring, and that review hasn't started, and we haven't heard an official announcement, although it is in the December 4th, mention of it is made in the December 4th publication called Breaking the Cycle.